Dear delegates, good afternoon. Could you please take your seats and we start? Please take your seats. Could we please request you, please take your seats. Dear delegates, take your seats. We start. Distinguished delegates, good afternoon. During the past few days, we have seen good progress on the work of the different contact groups. We would like to commend all our delegates, colleagues, and friends of the colleagues for their hard work and dedication. Although some progress has been made to advance the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, it is very slow and not significant. Dear delegates, we have only 2 days left, and we must make progress towards a framework that can be adopted at COP15 Part 2. Therefore, delegates, we need to act with urgency. Dear delegates, we are convening this plenary today for 3 purposes. First, we will take stock of the progress of our work under Agenda Item 4 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We will hear reports back from the colleagues of the 5 contact groups under this item. After hearing these reports, my co-chair and I would like to provide you with a status report on where we are with the negotiations. Second, we will take stock of the progress under Agenda Item 5 on DSI. We will hear a report back from the colleagues of the contact group under this item. Third, we will return to Agenda Item 4 and undertake a first reading of the revised draft decision for adoption at COP15 to provide an opportunity for initial feedback on this matter. Before we begin, we would like to invite the Secretariat to provide us with some logistical information for the meeting. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. In cooperation with the host country and the venue, the Secretariat has put in place measures, as you know, to reduce the risk of COVID-19 infection. All in-person delegates are required to be vaccinated and to self-administer a rapid antigen test every morning before proceeding to the venue. A negative test result must be shown to access the venue. Inside the venue, delegates are required to wear masks, face masks at all times, except when directly addressing the meeting or when eating or drinking in the restaurant areas. We have also endeavored to provide for social distancing and to avoid overcrowding. Accordingly, the total number of delegates allowed in this plenary room at any one time is limited, and for these reasons, the green and yellow secondary access passes are required in addition to the conference badge. Unfortunately, this means that the space available in this room for observers is limited. However, we have ensured that all stakeholder groups can be represented in this room, and additional space is provided in the gallery and in an overflow room. We acknowledge that this is not ideal, but we have endeavored to mitigate this inconvenience. Statements. Statements from regions will be limited to 6 minutes, parties to 3 minutes, major groups to 3 minutes, and observers to 2 minutes. As you know by now, a clock is provided on the screen to help you manage your time. But please do not speed up your reading. Rather, when speaking, please pause between sentences to make it easier for interpreters and delegates to follow you. For statements made in plenary, delegates are requested to upload their statements using the online application on the meeting page. Kindly note that the Statements Upload tab is only available for statements to be made during plenary sessions. They are made available to the interpreters to provide assistance with interpretation to the official UN languages. They are then published on the statements page where the party or organization uploading have elected for them to be visible on the statements page at the point of upload. They are only visible after delivery. With regard to submission of statements or texts for contact groups and Friends of Chair sessions that are conducted in English only, when permitted by co-lead of the particular group in question, those texts may be submitted via email to secretariat@cbd.int. They will then be forwarded to the relevant staff for further action. It would be very helpful if your subject line clearly indicates the contact group and issue being addressed. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Dear delegates, we will now turn our attention to our first item for today. And in that regard, I will hand over to my co-chair, Basil.
Thank you, Francis, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be back with you. Colleagues, we now invite you to consider Agenda Item 4 on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I would now like to give the floor to the co-lead of each of the contact group to provide us with the report on their work. We will like to begin by requesting a report back from Contact Group 1. Contact Group 1 is focusing on the goals of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This group is chaired by Mr. Vinod Mathur of India and Mr. Norbert Berlocher of Switzerland. I would like to now give the floor to Mr. Vinod Mathur. India, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. My co-lead and I would like to thank all delegations who participated in Contact Group 1 for their hard work, dedication, and the spirit of compromise. Our group met 3 times over the course of the week, and I am pleased to report that negotiations on all 4 goals have been completed, thanks to the additional 3rd slot which was provided to us. So we actually had not just 6 hours of discussion, but 10.5 hours of intense discussions. Delegations have demonstrated some willingness to reduce the number of alternative texts, and we now have text that includes all relevant elements and provides a strong basis for our further work in COP15. We have made some progress regarding the milestone elements, with some milestone elements being accommodated in this contact group, and others have been or will be dealt with other contact groups. Nevertheless, a relatively high number of brackets remain in the text, possibly because of their implications on the negotiations on other elements of the GBF, such as numerical aspects, description of ecosystems, scope of ABS, references to Article 20, numerical values for means of implementation, a definition of means of implementation, details to be provided either in the goal or in the glossary. And finally, the issue of planetary boundaries and sustainable development. There is still an issue regarding the need to balance the ambitious goals that are easy to communicate and comprehensive text that covers a large number of additional aspects. I would like to thank my co-lead, Mr. Nobe, and the Secretariat for their assistance. Thank you once again to all participants who contributed to the progress made in Contact Group 1. We are confident that we have made a good basis for the work on goals to be concluded in Montreal. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vinod Mathur. We would like now to request a report back from Contact Group 2. Contact Group 2 is focusing on target 1 to 8 on reducing threats for biodiversity. This group is being chaired by Ms. Teona Karchava of Georgia and Ms. Rosemary Patterson of New Zealand. I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Teona Karchava for the report. Can the floor be given to Georgia, please?
Thank you, Co-Chair. I would also like to thank all the participants of our group for the active participation. So far, we have had 2 sessions, one on Tuesday morning and then second one on yesterday night. The first discussions were held on the colleagues' proposals for targets 7 and 8 that were postponed from the Geneva meeting. Particularly, target 7 was discussed during the first session, and target 8 was discussed during the yesterday session. During these sessions, we have identified additional elements that participants think should be included in these 2 targets. And we have received finally target texts which are a bit rationalized and include all the elements, potential elements that parties consider important for these targets. However, further discussions are needed for these 2 targets, particularly text-based negotiations for the future sessions. At the same time, during the yesterday's session, we have started discussions on targets 1 to 8. However, we were only be able to start target 1. And in this regard, I should also mention that yesterday morning we have had Friends of College group held to discuss terminology issues related to the area descriptions for targets 1 to 3. But the Friends of College group were not able to reach the consensus. During the contact group meeting yesterday evening, and during the discussions on targets 1, we've been able to form a small group based on the initial interventions, and the small group came up with the rationalized texts of the target 1, which we plan to present for the next session, during the start of the next session, and offer this new alternative text for approval by the contact group meeting. We have also we are also planning to continue with targets 2 and 6, and we have planned so far 2 sessions for tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow evening session, and we hope that we will go through all these targets and come up with the more rationalized text with less brackets. And I should also mention that the group has also benefited for the updated scientific advice, which was quite useful for the group. And we also would like to thank for the science brief, the authors of the document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgia. We would like to now move to Contact Group 3. Contact Group 3, as you know, is focused on target 9 to 13 on nature contribution to people. This group has been co-chaired by Ms. Gillian Guthrie of Jamaica and Ms. Gabrielle Obermeier of Austria. I would like now to give the floor to Ms. Guthrie. Can the floor be given to Jamaica, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, we'd like to thank all the delegates and who participated in the contact group. We had some very constructive discussions, and I'm pleased to present to you on behalf of myself and my colleague, Gabrielle Obermeyer, from Austria, a report on the proceedings of the contact groups 3 on targets 9 to 13, which met 2 times on the 22nd of June and the 25th of June. At our first session, the contact group agreed to resume the negotiations by starting with target 13, followed by discussions on targets 9 and 10. On target 13, delegates were invited to consider the textual proposals submitted in Geneva that had been discussed, namely 13 bis, 13 bis alt, and 13 ter. As a result, it was agreed to delete 13 bis, and textual modifications were made to 13 bis alt. Some parties indicated that they would like to see more than one target addressing access and benefit sharing. The discussions moved to consider the composite text on the target 13, and good progress was made in lifting some of the brackets. Notwithstanding this progress, several areas of divergence remained, and in an effort not to lose momentum, the co-leads established an informal Friends of the Co-leads to continue discussions on target 13. And this Friends of the Co-leads was facilitated by Betty Schroeder from Namibia and Salima Kampner from Belgium. And the final 30 minutes of our first session on target 19 was also discussed in our first session with some slightly edited text. The Friends of the Co-lead met on the 23rd of June, and their objective was to reduce the number of brackets in the composite text. And that small group comprised representatives from Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, the EU, Japan, Malawi, Namibia, Norway, and the Republic of Korea. And they met on June 23, and they did an excellent job in giving us a more composite text, which is now target 13, and we have another target 13 ter. Our second meeting was held earlier today, and we tackled again target 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And during that session, the parties agreed to continue working on the alternative text proposed by the co-leads on target 9. And during that session, some brackets were lifted, but some fundamental issues emerged on certain concepts and issues, including sustainable use, promotion and development of sustainable biodiversity products, and this led to additional text being added and bracketed. On target 10, the parties had accepted the text that emerged from the work of a small group in Geneva as the basis for further negotiations. However, there were divergences on the inclusion of approaches or concepts such as agroecology, agrobiodiversity, productive systems, and other concepts which led to a longer composite text which we use as the reference when we discuss target 13 at COP 15.2. Mr. Chair, I would like to pause here to ask the delegates when we meet again to discuss target 13, 10, and 11, which are a little bit challenging, that they be a little bit more, to use the intersessional period to have discussions amongst themselves on some of these key concepts and issues that cannot be resolved at this meeting. For target 12, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to say that we were able to clear that text. So we have clean text for target 12, and that will be good going into COP 15.2. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And we note your comments about possible coordination or discussion among parties. Perhaps you can be available to help with that. Thank you. We would now like to request a report back from Contact Group 4. Contact Group 4 is focusing on target 14 to 21, tools and solution, and on and this group is shared by two colleagues, Madam Anne Teller of the European Union and Mr. Jorge Murillo of Colombia. I understand Madam Teller will be providing the report. And I can see, yes, if the floor can be given to the European Union for that report, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Contact Group 4 met on Wednesday 22nd of June and Thursday 23rd of June during the afternoon sessions. A third session of Contact Group 4 will be held this evening. Contact Group 4 was mandated to address targets 14 to 21 and the newly proposed targets 22 and 14 bis. The group had the opportunity to have a first round of discussions on target 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 1 and 19, 2 during the third meeting of the open-ended working group in Geneva. However, due to time constraints, the group was unable to address targets 20 and 21 and the newly proposed targets. In light of this, the first session of Contact Group 4, held here in Nairobi, began with a discussion on target 21 and the newly proposed targets 22 and 14 bis. Target 20 was discussed first, resulting in general conversions on issues and some cleaning of brackets left to do. This was followed by a discussion on target 21 and on the newly proposed target 22. Targets 21 and 22 were taken up together. While several parties indicated their preference to have two standalone targets, with target 21 focusing on IPLCs and target 22 on women and girls, the group has not yet found an agreement on this matter. This was followed by a discussion of the newly proposed target 14 bis, or target 23, which resulted in an understanding that target 14 will be withdrawn, 14 bis, will be withdrawn after verification that relevant concepts are covered elsewhere. In addition, one delegation proposed a new standalone target on One Health, and we informed the situation to the co-chairs, and they will propose guidance on the way forward. The second session of the group held yesterday afternoon had a second round of discussions on target 18, 19.1 and 19.2. We are very happy to say that the group succeeded in cleaning all the bracketed text in target 19.2 on capacity building, the first such achievement here in Nairobi. For target 18, on subsidies and positive incentives, the group agreed to work on the basis of Alt1 and succeeded in cleaning a number of brackets. For target 19.1, on increasing resources for biodiversity, a new alternative text was presented by one delegation on behalf of several developing country parties. A friend of the co-leads led by the UK and Costa Rica was established with the mandate to come back to the contact group at its third session this evening with consolidated text for target 19.1 that can be submitted to COP15-2. This group met today at lunchtime and initiated its work. An informal group will meet tonight at 6 to make further progress. This evening, after hearing from the friends of the co-leads on target 19.1, the third session of the contact group will have a second round of discussions on target 14 to 17, all of which were discussed for the first time in Geneva. During its session, the contact group has also taken note of some proposals for inclusion in the glossary. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, European Union. Let's now turn to Contact Group 6. Contact Group 6 is focusing on section A to E and H to K, including BBIS. This group is chaired by Ms. Mary May Jeremy Munzungaile of the Seychelles and Ms. Carolina Casares of Canada. I would like now to give the floor to Ms. Mary May Jeremy Munzungaile. Can the floor be given to the Seychelles, please?
Thank you, Co-Chair. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am pleased to present to you, on behalf of my colleague, Ms. Carolina Caceres of Canada, and myself, a progress report on the proceedings of Contact Group 6. The Contact Group met 4 times between the 21st and 23rd of June to consider sections A to E, H to K, BIBIS, milestones B3 and B4. During our first and second sessions on Tuesday, the group discussed sections H, J, and K. There was considerable convergence on these sections, but certain elements under section J required further consideration. A Friends of the Co-Leads group was established for section J. The Friends of the Co-Leads was facilitated by Ms. Ilham Mohamed of Maldives and Ms. Alison McMurrow of Australia, and it met on Wednesday for the first time. The group made progress on section J using the paper that was prepared and shared with the Bureau, but did not get through the whole document. The Friends of the Co-Leads will meet again today to complete their review. Section B BIST was discussed together with Section I and the milestones B3 and B4 during the second session of the contact group. The group began addressing issues of a general nature and continued to address these sections in clusters of paragraphs covering related topics. At its third meeting, the group completed the discussion of the 4 clusters and of the remaining paragraphs. During our fourth session on Thursday, the contact group heard interventions from parties and observers on sections A to E. Overall, there was general convergence of views on these sections. On section D, Theory of Change, parties were of the view that a revised graphic representation of the theory of change would be needed and suggested to keep the text in this section to a minimum. On section E, Vision and Mission, the contact group negotiated the 2030 mission, starting from the negotiated text of Open-Ended Working Group 3. The discussion resulted in 5 alternate versions of the mission, which will be included in the non-paper. Based on the deliberations, we will produce, with the support of the Secretariat, a non-paper that will take into consideration the views of the parties on section A to E and H to K, including some streamlining and reorganizing of some of the sections to reduce repetition. The non-paper will guide the discussion during our last session, scheduled on Saturday, 25th June at 10 a.m. On behalf of my co-lead, we also like to express our thanks to the delegates for their active contributions in all our sessions this week. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Seychelles, and thanks to all the co-leads for your diligent work. Colleagues, thank you for your many valuable input on this. We have given you have given us an excellent overview of the progress you have made in your contact group and other meeting. Now, my co-chair and I would like to present our reflection on the overall status of progress at this meeting so far and what remains to be done based on the information we receive from the co-lead. To prepare for this, we've consulted with the co-leads and contact group and other facilitator. We reviewed the text and looked at how it is in terms of completeness, conciseness, coherent, etc. Let us now go element by element, providing you with our update. We would like to recognize that we've prepared that yesterday night, and while we were meeting, there was meeting taking place, and there was also some meeting today where progress were made, and that progress is not reflected in the presentation you're going to see in a minute. So I'd like the Secretariat staff to put the presentation on the screen. So we worked by dividing the global biodiversity framework in 38 sections. Go back one slide, please. And those are the 38 sections, and then you can see it's pretty logical. That's the way you've been working section by section, goal by goals, and target by target. The first column to the left gives you information about the status as of yesterday night. So you can see comments about where we see things. The column in the middle gives you information about what we felt could be accomplished by the end of this week. And then the third column provides you what is remaining to be done. And you see a color coding there. When it's green, it is clean text, and that's a very good news. When it's yellow-orange, that means that there is a little bit of work to be done, some things to be done, but we're not necessarily terribly concerned. There is a way to do that. And when you see the color red, that means that there is some significant amount of work to be done. So with that in mind, let us go through the table. Section A and B, you can see that there is a discussion progressing and that most of the buckets have been removed, and we're confident with a little bit of work that the rest could be done. Section B bis, the guidance for implementation, there's been some extensive discussion, and parties will need to decide where you want to go with that. We understand that there is still some question on what's belong there, where, and that has impact throughout the GBF. Section C is pretty similar to A and B in the sense that it has advanced quite a bit and could be resolved relatively fast. D, on the theory of change, we understand there was some really good discussion. There is a proposal on the table, and the contact group have suggested that we could be in a position to revise that. So we're looking forward to our discussion with the author of that alternative and engage into that. Mission, extensive discussion on that, and that is a subject that is very important to many. There is, at the moment, five alternatives to be considered. Beside the notion of the five alternatives, we understand that two alternatives will be remaining after the discussion and will be addressed. Next slide, please. Now to the goals. We heard the report from Contact Group 1, extensive discussion and numerous brackets still on goal A, but I think this is progressing. There is still some discussion on whether to include numerical elements. That's going to be a significant question. The inclusion of milestone elements, description of ecosystem, and there is still a couple options in a number of cases. B, we heard the report as we were discussing and writing that yesterday with Francis. You were progressing, so we were happy to hear the report today. And we decided that we would not color that at all because it was pending your meeting. C and D, extensive discussion took place with numerous brackets that remain. There is potential to complete the negotiation and that's going to be improve the coherence with the targets. Still for C, there is the issue around the reference to digital sequence information and the scope in terms of derivative, ABS, etc. For D, the issue is around the reference to Article 20, as most of you know, and the definition of what is meant by implementation. And if you noted that the glossary may be useful for that. Next slide. Now to the target. Target 1 and 2 and 3, actually all the way down to 4, there was a lot of work to be done, but yet we see that there is a need to continue some of the work. In all of those cases, you see the note at the top saying that the resolution of numerical elements will likely take place at the COP. What we mean by that is what we expect here is that you will be able to resolve the concept, and if you're not able to resolve the numerical aspect in itself, that's probably something that is useful to deal with at the COP. So there is a number of issues around the description of area and ecosystem and some issues around the notion of removing brackets. Next slide, please. Moving to the next group of targets, there is a number of discussions that took place and that we were not able to reflect in that presentation. You heard directly the report from the contact group on target 5 and 6. clearly this is the same type of situation where we still have a lot of brackets. And if we want to have a focused COP, we're going to need to remove those brackets. 7, on pollution. Still again, the same note about the numerical elements. And there is still a lot of discussion on the type of pollution to be named in the target. On 8, there is still discussion even on on whether or not it is appropriate to have a numerical element in that. And then still that discussion, an important discussion on the terminology, nature-based solution and ecosystem-based approach. Next slide. Let's move on to one that advanced a little bit more. You see on 9, 10, and 11 that there's been a lot of progress. And we were briefed also on 12 that there has been some significant progress. And probably if we were to update our presentation, the color would be changing. 9, the horizontal issue on this one is one that is still needed some work. Whether on 10, all areas, productive sectors, and I was, as you know, sitting with you this morning in the discussion on those targets. Again, on 11, nature-based solution versus ecosystem-based approach. Target 13, a subject of a lot of discussion and work, and this is advancing, but we feel that there is still a lot of work to be done, both in terms of the placement of DSI and a number of targets on ABS that needs to be resolved. So that leaves us with a situation where we're going to need to be resolving alternative and we're going to need to deal with the access issue. Next slide, please. If we look at 14, 15, 16, and 17, we are pretty much in the same situation where there was first reading in Geneva. There is a lot of progress to be made, but I understand that there is still opportunity to do so, and we are at risk to having some brackets, but that is depending on you. 18, still some work, and there again there was some progress in terms of cleaning up, but there is brackets that are there, and further work is needed. And the numerical elements, of course, will also be dealt with at the COP. Next slide, please. 19, and there 19 is divided into 2 parts. 19.1 on financial resource, where there is still several alternatives on the table, and that's going to be a challenge to address in the remaining time. And then, of course, there will be the numerical elements. 19.2, on the other end, there was good progress and very pleased to see clean text there. Information and knowledge, as well as target 21 on participation of IPLC women, girls, and youth. There we are seeing some good progress, and with a little bit of effort, I think we can reduce that, but it may be that we were left with some bracket in the end. Gender, there is still the discussion, but mainly there is an issue here about whether you want a separate target or not. And we've also been made aware that there is a proposal of a new target on health. And there is also a need to have a conversation whether you want that as a separate target and whether the proposal that is on the table is addressing the issue. Next slide. On target, now we're getting to the end with the section at the back that are also very important aspect: implementation and support mechanism, enabling condition. And you see that the implementation mechanism, we're getting very close. On enabling condition, there is a discussion there, and this is also dependent on the progress we're going to be able to make on BBIS. So question is whether we're going to need to retain the elements of that section or not. Section J on responsibility and transparency. It is now a friend of the chair. This is advancing relatively well, yet we could not give it a green at this point in time, but we're looking forward to be proven wrong. And then the discussion will continue, and I'm sure there will be some aspect that will be continue to be discussed. And finally, on section K, on outreach, we're in a good place, and we're confident that we're there. So this completes my part of the presentation, and I'll turn to Francis for the next slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair. So, dear delegates, this is just the summary of what Co-Chair has been presenting in those various sections and targets and goals of the framework. So you can clearly see that there are 14 elements which are in red that you need to deal with. Then there are the 21 in yellow, 2, we have only made progress up to 2 elements which are in green, and then 1 is still pending. So we now need to be moving from this red part to perhaps yellow, even if possible, straight away to green, and then the yellow to green in the next 2 days, like we told you. So there's a lot to be done, but we thank you for having made the effort up to this point to have come up with these 2. And for those yellow parts, which you have told you, some amount of work needs to be done, but perhaps there is a bit of common understanding now there, meaning you could easily advance work there. But see how you move from the 14, you move the 14 either to the green part or to the yellow part, but most preferably the green part, because we need a text here which can go to the COP, which facilitates discussion there. So the next slide, please. So in terms of general conclusions, we can tell you that really you guys have worked very hard so far. We cannot say that there has not been significant work here. All this discussion is part of the significant work we are talking about, and you can see that the discussions have been going on till late in the evening. Proposals to increase the number of targets is coming up. It is increasingly becoming a carrot and something so appetizing for you delegates. The targets are 21. When we do analysis, it's tending towards 25. Do you want 25 targets? But remember, we needed to keep these targets fewer. So please see how you reduce this. It is good for now to look at all those proposals, whether it is 19.1, 19.2, or it is this and that, but at the end of it all, like the one on health, see whether it can be integrated elsewhere, and we don't duplicate a lot, but we are in your hands on that. Our analysis also shows that at the current pace, you've seen it, it will not be possible to have a text for COP15. You've seen the red. That is just something we need to work on. So several issues that ought to be resolved at this working group will remain to be dealt with later. Then we're also thinking of reviewing the whole text of the GBF for consistency, coherence, and ease of communication. But we need to make progress if we are going to look at that, because we need to compile everything and see how does the framework now shape up. And then we can also discuss that. Next slide, please. So what is our proposal? And I think after here, perhaps we shall go to the next. That we need to be working a lot, improving our process here. We are, of course, having these small informal groups of negotiations or negotiators that is taking place amongst you people. And then we have the small informal groups also to engage with the parties, because we've seen, although we had only friends of the co-leads, that even as the discussions have gone on, we have ended up again having smaller groups. And we want to encourage you and really acknowledge that as long as it is giving us the output we need, please, that is so welcome, because sometimes it is a lot easier to agree in a smaller setting than in a bigger setting. So those smaller groups that are coming up, if they are given the right things to do, I think they are going to ease our progress here. Text to be discussed in the contact groups also, we'll see how we do that, in the plenary, like I was saying here. And I think we have told you that when it comes to the review of the whole, we are going to be working with the Bureau to identify the options on how best we could do that. And I think, next slide. Yes, so we could stop there. So co-chair, maybe you continue from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. As you can see, there remain a lot of work, and I can only underline the word of Francis. And we need to work and see how much we can do. You've demonstrated this morning that we can pick up the pace. That is clear, and you've also shown that we can make best use of all the various formats that we have in front of us. We urge you to focus on the area that we've highlighted just now, and we ask you to continue to work in the spirit of compromise and cooperation. We had hoped that there would have been time for an in-depth review, but the contact group needs, and you need as much time as possible in the contact group. Therefore, we will assemble the current draft of the text of all sections of the framework into a single document for your consideration, and we'll bring that to the plenary as a CRP. We hope that we can present you with that state of play. I'll now pause for a second to see. I see New Zealand requesting the floor. Can the floor be given to New Zealand, please?
Thank you very much, co-chairs. New Zealand is making this statement on behalf of the Just Cans group. It's clear from the presentation of the co-chairs that there is more work to be done and very limited time to do it. This calls for difficult decisions to be made about prioritization of our time at COP15. All too often we arrive at a COP and discover that our time is not sufficient. Our view is that we need the Bureau to start planning ahead now, carefully and realistically, and to reflect on the most critical items for discussion at COP. All the work of the OEWG, SUBSTA, and SPI is important, but we need to consider what at COP is critical and have a clear plan so that we are working together on the basis of the same shared expectations about how we will make the best use of our time together in Montreal. We would like to request that the report of this meeting include a reference to the Bureau undertaking this important planning work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, New Zealand. Distinguished, I see Morocco requesting the floor. Est-ce qu'on peut donner la parole au Maroc, s'il vous plaît?
Morocco has the floor. Thank you very much, co-chair. Mrs. Co-chairperson, Mrs. Executive Secretary, and co-chairs. Besides all the praises I believe we righteously are having with respect to the various delegates for their comprehensive implication and for the very efficient contribution, we need to understand that in the backstage of this meeting, I have to confess to you that there is some kind of preoccupation that is felt in the air. This preoccupation indeed comes to undermine the optimism that throughout our organization and our meeting is transpiring, and what was the feeling in the beginning of this event. Despite the very good intentions of the co-leads and the contact groups, and despite your request that parties do not come up with further new elements to the base text, well, that was not really the case. You did ask for as little brackets as possible to find their way in the text. Nevertheless, unfortunately, some texts, dear co-chairperson, are now doubled, sometimes even tripled in volume because of all these additions. Quite frankly, I have the impression that sometimes, not always, happily, that instead of going ahead, we're going backwards. And the whole work of Nairobi is taking the risk of being transposed to Montreal and COP15. Dear co-chairperson, dear Mr. Co-chairperson, rather than coming in with pessimistic, unwanted comments, I would like to endorse the optimistic ideas of Mr. Francis, co-chairperson, in the beginning of this meeting, and implore that the 2 remaining days ahead of us be dedicated to something more substantial. Let us be more than ever adherent to a spirit of compromise in order to alleviate the workload of all those who will be at the next COP15. I have to say, I do not like the wooden language, but I need to echo some truths. After all, you may have been more diplomatic in so saying, but it transpires, and I am doing that myself. I am being less diplomatic. I have to excuse myself, and please forgive me, colleagues. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-chairperson.
Maroc, c'est toujours un
Thank you, Morocco. It's always a pleasure to follow you.
the floor to be given to Namibia. Technician, floor to Namibia, please.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Namibia is so concerned about the pace of progress happening here. But we think that there might be value in an editorial exercise that preserves the positions that have been added in by various parties as bracketed text. In the form maybe of a bulleted list. Because our understanding of the process is that people are adding in things that are important to them in a national context or from a particular perspective. And in the implementation of the GBF, those things are going to be important. And it might well help the process to take the text that we have or the text that we end up with here and reduce it or rearrange it so that the headlines of the targets are clear, and then all of the other elements of concern to parties, even if they're concerns to just 1 or 2 parties, are captured in the text that goes forward to Montreal. I think that would allow us to deal with those issues one by one in a much more visually simple and easy to understand way. We can keep them or agree to drop them, but we would disentangle them from the current very difficult to read bracketed text. And it would make it much easier for delegates here when they go back to Capital and consult the head of the COP to clearly explain to decision makers why the issues are there in the text. And that might well help, I think, to come to a real compromise much quicker in a much more efficient way when we get to Montreal. Thank you, Coach.
Thank you, Namibia, for those useful recommendations. This now complete that part. Distinguished delegates, before moving to the next item, I would like to give the floor to the representative of the COP15 presidency, Ms. Zhu Gourmet. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair and dear colleagues, distinguished delegates. Having heard from our co-chairs on the status of progress, allow me to first thank you for all your very hard work during the past few days here in beautiful Nairobi. Indeed, we made some progress and managed to get clean text for some targets, which is really a good start. Maybe we should consider setting up a clean text award. Let us get the same momentum going with the rest of the issues. We need more and more clean text. The progress we have made is a little bit limited because we have such a high expectation for the Nairobi meeting. It is clear that more needs to be done. We only have 2 days left until the end of our meeting. By when? We need to have a concise, aspirational, and communicable document sent to the conference of the parties. Before we can leave Nairobi, we need a text that is in a form that will enable negotiators at COP to be able to recognize and negotiate the final stage of post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We need a text that will make it clear to the ministers what the critical and outstanding issues are that need to be resolved to enable them to reach a final agreement. We may not resolve all issues here in Nairobi, but we must aim to simplify the text as much as possible. It is not the time for adding new words or variations on the theme. It's a time to narrow down the text to the essentials that include the key issues and distinct options in brackets where necessary. Dear colleagues, the world is counting on us. Let us make the best of our collective efforts in the remaining days we have left in Nairobi. The COP presidency reiterates its commitment to continue supporting this important process from now until December this year, when we will make history with the adoption of a robust and effective post-2020 biodiversity framework. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Let us now turn to the next issue under the agenda. So, Francis, over to you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Dear delegates, let us now turn to Agenda Item 5 on Digital Sequence Information, DSI, on genetic resources. We would now like to request a report back from the co-leads of Contact Group 5, that is Ms. Letitia of South Africa and Gaute of Norway. Understand it is Letitia going to give us this report. Give the mic to South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and greetings to all. The contact group was mandated to continue work on the text of the draft decision for COP15 as contained in Annex 2, Recommendation 3/2 of the working group, and met on Wednesday, 22nd June 2020 from 7:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m. The session opened with a first general round of comments and views on the work of the Informal Coaches Advisory Group, focusing in particular on the contents of paragraphs 10 and 11 of document CBD-WG2020-04/3. We then invited a second round of comments and views on the draft decision for COP15, as contained in the annex of Recommendations 3/2 of the working group. We had many views indicating that the work and advice of the Informal Coaches Advisory Group was well received and useful for the work of the contact group. Furthermore, we heard that many parties supported the suggestion to work further on the draft COP decision. Based on the 2 rounds of comments, We established a friend of the co-leads group to start text-based negotiations on the draft COP decision. This group is facilitated by Ms. Mphatso Kalemba of Malawi and Mr. William Lockhart of the United Kingdom. And they convened the group immediately after the close of the session of the contact group. The Friends of the Co-Lead group met from 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. After an initial exchange of views on the way forward, the Friends group agreed to consider the draft COP decision, starting from the first preambular paragraph. By 12 a.m., the group had finalized its consideration of all preambular paragraphs. The resulting text is considerably simplified, including 3 entirely clean paragraphs out of the 6, which was met with applause. There was a highly cooperative spirit in the room among the Friends, continuing the momentum from Geneva. The Friends agreed that it would be useful to cluster paragraphs covering similar ideas to assist them in removing redundancies in the text and to enable them to better understand and identify the main areas of contention. The Friends agreed that this will prepare the terrain to negotiate an agreement at COP15 in Montreal. The Friends expressed that they would need more time to complete the work and will meet today at 7:30 p.m. The contact group will then reconvene later this week, and that is tomorrow on Saturday in the afternoon, to consider the outcomes of the work of the Friends group. Let me conclude by thanking my co-lead, Mr. Gaute von Hansen, the co-facilitators of the Friends group, Ms. Mphatso Kalemba and Mr. William Lockhart, for their excellent role in leading this process. The Friends of the co-leads and parties for the warm spirit of cooperation on the issue of DSI. And finally, the Secretariat staff for the dedicated support and commitment within which they have assisted us. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Letitia, and thanks to your colleague for your hard work and diligence. Ladies and gentlemen, dear delegates, my co-chair and I would now like to present an overview slide on the DSI. We had previously done the one for the GBF. And again, you can see here on the status that there is progress in the discussion, as you've heard from just the colleagues. And there are some few plain texts, you've heard that already. So this is the status as it is. But in terms of progress or where we are at the moment, is that a recommendation to the COP15 that contains some clean text, is there now, while we still have a number of paragraphs that we need to resolve. So that's why you see that element of green there, because you've made progress. But if you are conversant with that very document, you will see that still there's a lot to be done. And that is why you will see that we put again yellow on the other side. And the issues on DSI, preferably the political options that could be addressed at this stage in time. Next slide. And I think that is it. You could now, that completes the slides that we had for you when we started with presenting you those slides. So dear delegates, unless I see some, I don't see requests for the floor, so I will now hand over to my co-chair to take us to the next agenda item. Co-chair.
Thank you, Francis. Distinguished delegates, let us now turn to agenda item 4. We'll now have the first reading of the revised draft decision for adoption at COP15 under this item. At part 2 of our third meeting, the working group decided to defer consideration of the draft decision. Accordingly, the working group will be invited to consider the draft decision as part of its recommendation to COP15. I will now give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the document on this item. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. For this part of the agenda item, the meeting has before it document CBD/work WG 2020-3/3/add3, which provides draft elements of a possible decision operationalizing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This document was previously made available to the third meeting of the working group. The document was revised in light of the comments made during the virtual session of that meeting in August 2021. However, it was not considered further during the in-person session in Geneva due to time constraints. As such, the document is unchanged from what was presented to the working group when it last met. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. As the addendum document is new for this meeting, we believe it would be useful to hear your thoughts and reflection on it. We would now like to open the floor for intervention on agenda item 4 on this matter. We'll start by regional groups, followed by parties, other governments, and observers, and we encourage you to keep your statement as short and concise as possible. We will now move to intervention from regional group. I will now open the floor for that. Starting, I see the European Union is asking for the floor. Please, can the microphone be given to the European Union?
Thank you, Co-Chair. The EU and its member states thank the co-chairs for this draft decision, which will be important to provide guidance to the parties on the implementation of the GBF. We recognize that this decision will be an important item of discussion at the COP. However, important parts of this decision depend on further progress in the negotiations of the GBF. Therefore, we think it would be premature to discuss this draft decision now. We suggest that parties be given the opportunity to submit written comments for this draft as a basis for discussion at the COP. This way, it would allow us to focus our efforts on the work in the contact groups and the friends of the chair. A discussion on this draft decision now, in parallel on ongoing negotiations, would duplicate the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I do not see any other requests from the floor from regional groups. Let us now move to parties. I now open the floor for intervention by parties. I see Cameroon asking for the floor, followed by Argentina. Cameroon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chairperson. Cameroon would like to support the European Union's position. We need to say that at the current level of evolution of our works, we are as yet to have all those elements that would have allowed us to efficiently contribute to this exchange for the kind of work. So we need to have more time so that works may progress and that we may also in this way efficiently and efficaciously contribute to the text of a decision that is meant to be so critical for COP15. Thank you very much.
Cameroon.
Thank you, Cameroon. Argentina.
From my list, but I know that Palau has requests for the floor remotely, so can the floor be given to Interactio for Palau? I know this takes a little bit of time. Palau, you're on mute.
Good evening, Chair. Could you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you, Chair. Palau would like to support the statement made by the EU to defer discussions on this document pending the current discussions on the contact groups. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I get the sense that I'm going to get a lot of intervention in the same way. So I'm going to ask all of you to take your hand down unless you want to oppose that notion of postponing. So if you're in favor of postponement, take your hand down. If you still want to comment, keep your hand up. All right. The list is considerably shorter. So I will go to Brazil, followed by Argentina. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And Brazil would like to express its appreciation to the efforts of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group and the co-leads of the contact groups. From the outset, Brazil would like to express its concern regarding the current stage of negotiations, as we have been able to agree upon an unlimited number of targets, and many outstanding issues remain unresolved. While we understand the concerns raised by the EU and others on the possibilities of engaging within the discussion of the draft decision at this stage, we do find it important to start initiating the process of identifying some core elements the parties may wish to include. Regarding the draft elements of a possible decision, Brazil believes that additional elements must be considered. We would suggest adding a new paragraph, which must recognize that the post-2020 GPF will be implemented in line with the principles of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, in particular the principle of CBDR. It should further recognize that nothing in the post-2020 GPF shall be interpreted as implying a change in the rights and obligations of a party under any existing international agreement. In addition, Brazil is of the view that the draft decision adopting the post-2020 GBF must address the intrinsic interlinkages between the GBF and means of implementation. Brazil believes that we must all do our part. At the same time, Operative Paragraph 6 must recall Article 20, in particular Article 20.4, thus reiterating that the extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under this convention and the post-2020 GBF will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under this convention related to financial resources and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account the fact that economic and social development and eradication of poverty are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. Furthermore, Brazil believes that the draft decision must set out a time frame for the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Fund and the multilateral global benefit sharing mechanism if we are to achieve a truly transformative and meaningful post-2020 GPF. We will submit our comments in written form. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. And thank you for submitting the document. I will now move to Argentina, followed by Canada.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Argentina thanks the first draft of these elements in order to adopt the framework that we hope to adopt in Montreal in December. Our delegation is also very concerned by the slow pace of this negotiation, and we understand what's been expressed by other delegations, and we know that these decisions should be reviewed in the future, and we will take this opportunity in order to make some comments about it. First of all, Argentina believes that the decision should reaffirm the principles of Rio, and the contents of this declaration are the cornerstone of our convention and thus of the global framework. The decision should also acknowledge the need of implementing all articles of the Convention that are relevant in connection with the cooperation and the transfer of technology, including sections 18 and 19. Third, the decision should strengthen the fact that the global framework is a tool for the implementation of the Biodiversity Convention, and that it will contribute to reach the objectives of sustainable development. Number 4, the decision of the framework should reaffirm that the elimination of poverty and the development are priorities for the developing countries. Number 5, the adoption of the framework should be done at the same time that the strategy of the mobilization of resources. This is key for a quick implementation of the global framework starting on December 18, 2022. Number 6, as we've pointed out in the SPI, we have reserves about the possibility of adopting the mainstreaming in long run. That is why we do not favor its inclusion in the COP decision. Number 7, Argentina supports strongly the inclusion of paragraph 8 of the decision in line with the Article 20 of the Convention, and we consider its inclusion essential. Number 8, we consider that it's very important that the decision calls upon the SBI to continue working in order to improve the implementation of the Convention, and we believe that the preparation of options in this regard should be done in consultation with the parties. My delegation has uploaded comments on the website reflecting these initial observations to the project, to the draft, and we will also make more contributions in the future as the global framework development moves forward. Thank you.
Gracias, Argentina. Je vais passer maintenant la parole.
Now I'd like to pass the floor to Canada and then the Russian Federation. Canada, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
And thank you again. We think it's long overdue to have at least an initial discussion about the draft COP15 decision on the Global Biodiversity Framework. On one hand, I think we all realize that what we're ultimately going to agree upon in the Global Biodiversity Framework will be a very delicate balance. And so, I think we first like to say that we need to be careful about not trying to renegotiate this delicate balance in a draft decision. And so from that perspective, we understand why it probably wouldn't be useful right now to have a discussion because we run the risk of doing that. However, we do think it's important to remind ourselves of a very important point and to reaffirm, and it's basically to reaffirm that what we are negotiating in the GBF is our strategic plan for the next 8 years. And a strategic plan is something that identifies priorities and needs to be what really drives what we do as a CBD community going forward. And so we think we would really like to see clear text in a draft decision that highlights that that the framework in the end is what is going to identify those key priorities and should really drive how we organize ourselves, how we organize our meetings, where we focus our effort, where we focus our resources, our budgets, and how we basically align all of our work within the CBD to focus in on those high priority areas. We have text prepared, but I don't think it'd be useful at this moment to share it with the room, but we certainly will follow up and present that in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. I'll now pass the floor to the Russian Federation, followed by Australia. Technician, pass the floor to Russian Federation.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We have the same sensation as many delegations, particularly referring to the esteemed delegate of Morocco just a couple of minutes ago on, unfortunately, a rather slow process and progress, which very often, as we understand, is related to the unreadiness of certain delegations to reach compromise. Also, we are concerned about the procedure that all the targets and goals that we have looked into during the last few days, the text becomes longer and longer instead of shorten it down. We would like to point out the very great importance of this document under discussion. We all know that the GBF is just an appendix to the CBD. It is important as well, and we will use it as basis, but the introduction of GBF is going to happen under the CBD. And sometimes we tend to forget about that there should be a decision by the COP, and the decision should include the instruments to implement the GBF that in their turn should not be included in the GBF. And then it is important to remember about point number 5. In parallel with the GBF in Montreal, we will have to adopt a number of a package of other documents to provide implementation of the GBF. And what we are now trying to include into the GBF should belong to these other documents that are contained in point 5. Let us all remember about that and define the right place for our considerations, texts, and wishes, for that matter. And if we remember about this, even if we are not going to discuss this document today, so that we remember about very important documents that we have to adopt in Montreal, without which it is not possible, it is not going to be possible to implement the GBF as such. We all remember how many time and effort was used to prepare the programs on different thematic and intersectoral areas. These are also very important. It is very important not just to decide what we have to arrive at, but also on how we are going to do that. So we are prepared not to discuss this text. We heard a very important deliberations from Argentina, from Brazil. I'm not going to list our proposals here, as well as Canada has done it. We are going to submit them in writing. But if we are not going to look into this document today, tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, then I would like to have the answer when. Do I understand correctly that this is all is postponed for the COP15, and we postponed the discussion of this document until December this year? Thank you. Is it so? Thank you.
Pass the floor to Australia, followed by Colombia. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. The adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a very important occasion, noting that it will guide and set priorities for our individual and collective efforts for the next 8 years. The COP decision is an opportunity to properly contextualise the framework and reaffirm important principles. It is really important that we get it right and that we do spend time discussing it. Australia is largely supportive of the current draft, but we do have several suggestions that we would like to make. These suggestions are related to giving appropriate recognition of the role of the framework as the strategic plan for the Convention and its protocols, and ensuring the work under the Convention is clearly aligned to the framework. Secondly, we would like to remove the ambiguous qualifier flexible that is in front of the words global framework a couple of times through the decision. Thirdly, ensuring consistency with the directions and outcomes of the discussions that we have had here in Nairobi on implementation. Also, emphasising the importance of the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders in the implementation of the framework, and including persons of diverse gender identities in the list of stakeholders. Regarding resource mobilisation, Australia would like to reiterate that all parties have obligations, and we suggest the decision text could better reflect this. We support appropriate references to the financial support needs of small island developing states, as we recognise that there are many SIDS in the Pacific region that require implementation assistance, who are on the front line of experiencing both climate change and effects and biodiversity declines. We have a number of specific textual proposals that we will submit to the Secretariat in writing, and we look forward to further constructive discussions on the draft decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Pass the floor to Colombia, followed by the United Kingdom. Colombia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Colombia agradece a los presidentes por el borrador de decisión.
Colombia would like to thank the co-chairs for the draft decision. We do have some preliminary comments, but along with what Canada has expressed and the European Union has expressed, is that we are still in the early stages of negotiations, and therefore it is not the right time to discuss them. However, we need to have a clear analysis of the implementation methods, the framework of monitoring, and the glossary. It is important to have a holistic approach of all sessions within the framework in order to have a decision-making process that will allow us to have the best content possible. Likewise, we consider that we need to focus, since we have not done it in a comprehensive fashion, just like New Zealand mentioned it, and focus on a work program that is focused in the fundamental elements of the package post-2020 before we get to the COP15 in such a way that would allow us to adopt it accordingly in December. Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the floor to the United Kingdom, followed by New Zealand. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. The UK begs your indulgence to make a few small points with respect to the way that the decision handles the important question of implementation, as highlighted by many of the colleagues who've already spoken. The UK has been consistently clear that the implementation of the post-2020 GBF will require a significant increase in the mobilisation of resources from all sources. The UK has also been clear that we recognise the obligations on us and on all parties under the Convention. That's why the UK is committed to spend $3.7 billion internationally on nature between 2021 and 2025. And that is why, as COP26 presidents, we've worked hard to secure commitments totaling as much as $12 billion to tackle deforestation and land use change. It was on the basis of those commitments that in Geneva, I promised that the UK would engage in these negotiations in the spirit of honesty and realism. It was honesty and realism that enabled me to say at that meeting in Geneva that, for example, the total amount of international aid deployed in 2020 for all purposes, education, health, defense, climate, nature, all purposes, was $160 billion US. All purposes, $160 billion. As we think today about the draft decision and the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, I think it might also now be important, in the spirit of honesty and realism, to recall some other important facts. Facts like, for example, the Paulson report, on which so many of our conversations are currently predicated, only ever estimates that at a maximum, 5% of the biodiversity financing gap should be filled by international public finance. 5%, not 100%. And facts like the $100 billion climate finance target is not a bilateral ODA target, not an international aid target. In fact, for nearly a decade, about 70% of the funding for that target has been derived from non-bilateral sources. There is simply no precedent for a $100 billion public fund for climate. Mr. Co-Chair, in the spirit of ensuring that the decision provides an honest and realistic reflection of the context in which we should discuss the implementation of the GBF, the UK would like to suggest 2 amendments to the preambular text. First, we'll insert a preambular paragraph, a new preambular paragraph, which states that we welcome the conclusion of the GEF8 replenishment cycle, which saw the overall amount pledged by 29 countries increase by 30% to more than $5.25 billion, and which saw an absolute increase in funding for biodiversity of more than 46%. Second, we will amend the preambular paragraph, which explains that none of the Aichi targets have been fully achieved. Instead, we will propose an amendment to reflect the fact that the 2013 commitment in Hyderabad on the mobilization of international public finance was first met only 2 years later, in 2015, has been consistently met each and every year since, and that the achievement of that sub-target is explicitly recognized in GBO5. We'll submit our comments in writing. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, United Kingdom. I'll pass the floor to New Zealand, followed by Switzerland. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. We agree that the current draft is a good basis for discussion, taking into account the fact that, of course, some elements remain subject to the ongoing negotiations. We are pleased to see that a number of changes we had earlier requested have been incorporated. We agree with the points made by the distinguished delegates of Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. We wish to make just 2 specific points on the text before us. First, we acknowledge that discussions are ongoing on Section B bis, and that the draft decision in paragraph 11 does refer to the full and effective contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities, among others. Nonetheless, it is our view that this decision should include a specific reference to Indigenous rights, as a paragraph L bis to read, reiterates its expectation that parties and other governments will ensure that the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected and given effect to in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Second, Co-Chair, we are somewhat concerned at the lack of specificity in paragraph 18C. It is our view that parties should decide the nature of any further guidance materials to be prepared by the Secretariat. Accordingly, we propose that this subparagraph be deleted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, New Zealand. I'll now pass the floor to Switzerland, followed by Norway. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And let me first indicate that we believe it is important that we use that time now just to collect first reaction comments to that draft decision, because at one moment we will have to solve all the open issues here. And so it's good if you are able here now to share our initial views on it, and that based on that perhaps you might prepare a second draft on which we can then have a closer look either on later during this week or then in Montreal. First of all, our first comment would be, we think we always prefer short and clear decisions that are addressing the issues that have to be addressed. Many of the operational paragraphs indeed could be moved in the preamble because they're just noting something, being aware of something and not taking decisions. So we would propose that all the operational paragraphs that are not really doing something specifically would be moved to the preamble. Secondly, we would also caution against introducing concepts into that framework that are not part of the Biodiversity Convention. And therefore, concepts like CBDR clearly do not belong into the context. I think we should not change the frame under which we are working, but we should strengthen the frame within which we are working. Thirdly, we would support specifically the proposal made by New Zealand on the last paragraph, but also the two proposals made by UK. We would fully support that, and also support the proposal made by Australia with regard to the word flexibility. Then we will also hand in some specific wording proposals around 3 different thematic areas. The one is on finance. With regard to the finance, we would certainly not support any conditionality, as it was introduced here sometimes in the text here. But we would like really that the decision, if it is addressing finances at all, then it would clearly live up and reflect our common commitment that all those countries in a position to do so should provide support to those countries who need such support. Secondly, we will also make wording proposals with regard to national priorities. We think the wording and the phrases used now in the decision are not reflecting what we want to say. What we want to say, I think, is that the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework should be a national priority. And then thirdly, we will also make concrete wording proposal in order to strengthen further the element that we expect that all conventions, all biodiversity-related conventions should contribute to the implementation of that global biodiversity framework, and they would really also invite them to further strengthen their cooperation in that sense. Thank you very much.
Merci, la Suisse. I would give the floor to Norway, followed by South Africa. Norway, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Norway welcomes the opportunity to provide comments to the decision text with the understanding that further discussions will be needed once we know the final outcome of COP15. We suggest a clear reference to new finance from Jeff, while we will give developing countries the means to quickly put the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework into practice. We suggest to include a text emphasizing that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework must be implemented in a manner consistent with existing human rights obligations. We will propose to add the text recognizing that the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework depends on full recognition of the crucial role of indigenous peoples and local communities. We also believe that all parties have a duty to protect their own biodiversity in line with Article 20, but that their capabilities to do so differ, and that the draft decision should also reflect this. And the GBF is more than just goals and targets. It also includes mechanisms for implementation, such as Section J on responsibility and transparency. We will suggest to amend Para 4 to reflect this. We also made a revision to 18A. We suggest to delete some paras that we think are clearly redundant at this point, paras 18B and C and para 5. And then I would like to support the comments made by the UK, and also the comments made by Switzerland on CBDR, because when the convention was negotiated, there was made a careful assessment on what principles that should be included in the convention and what principles should not be included. And the CBDR was not included. So it's not a part of the Convention on Biological Diversity and should clearly not therefore be a part or a basis for our negotiations. However, we do know that capabilities differ between countries, and therefore developed country parties must offer assistance in this regard. We will hand in our suggested edits in writing. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Norway. I would like now to pass the floor to South Africa, that will be followed by Bosnia Herzegovina. South Africa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Co-Chair. South Africa appreciates elements of the draft possible decision for operationalization, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We also agree with others that the elements of the draft recommendation depends on the current discussion in different contact groups, and we therefore support the deferring of this discussion. South Africa wished to emphasize that the framework should create a balance and enhance implementation of the Convention's 3 objectives and its protocols. As such, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should be implemented in accordance with the national priorities and capabilities, and all its targets should equally contribute to the attainment of the 2050 vision, and therefore they should be equally resourced. We are also...
South Africa, can I ask you to slow down? I think our interpreters are challenged.
My apology. We also agree with Brazil that the current decision must recognize some of the discussions that are relevant to the provision of Article 16, 20, and 21 of the Convention, such as making reference to the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Fund to mobilize additional fund that is required for the implementation of the GBF. We also call for a mechanism to support capacity building, scientific and technical cooperation, and technology transfer from developing countries. We also like to see a decision on DSI included, as this working group is expected to make a recommendation in this regard. South Africa will be submitting its textual proposal to the Secretariat in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa. I'll now move to Bosnia Herzegovina, followed by Costa Rica. Bosnia Herzegovina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Firstly, Bosnia Herzegovina supports the statement given by EU and Cameroon in the beginning of this discussion. Therefore, we will briefly give only a few general comments on the decision text. Bosnia Herzegovina will focus on elements that considers to be generally missing in the draft decision. In general, the adoption of Global Biodiversity Framework is 2 years late for reason known to all. We believe it is important to make reference in the preambular paragraphs to the strategic plan 2011-2020, and for the record to mention the reasons for delay in deciding on the post-2020 framework for biodiversity. On the other hand, in the operational paragraphs, there is no any reference to year 2030. We believe that avoiding the 2030 reference and focusing on the 2050 vision only does not contribute to understanding of the urgent need for action on biodiversity. We are not in the favor of decision to belong and to include the text of GBF being currently negotiated, but we believe that it should provide international community and national governments with the basis for urgent action. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Bosnia Herzegovina. I'll now pass the floor to Costa Rica, followed by the Republic of Korea. Costa Rica tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Thank you, Co-Chair. Costa Rica urges that all the parties to continue the efforts to complete these negotiations of GBF. For Costa Rica, a global 30 by 30 target within a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework is a key part of the solution to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We are going to continue engaged in this process together with all the parties towards the adoption of 30 by 30 target at the CBD's 15 Conference of the Parties later this year. We call on the 97 parties that have joined this great ambition to double the effort we have made so far. Costa Rica is sure that the new generations will appreciate your vision. We have some observations for the decision, and we will be sending it in the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Costa Rica. Give me a second to confer with the Secretary. Thank you. Republic of Korea, followed by Japan. Republic of Korea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First of all, we would like to thank the co-chairs and the Secretariat for preparing this draft decision. Our intervention is on one of the basic principles that would not be affected by the result of the ongoing contact group discussions. Our delegation would like to emphasize the importance of the cooperation between the CBD and our other UN bodies on the implementation of the GBF for synergies. In addition to the current list of organizations in paragraph 16 of the draft decision, we would like to include UNESCO, particularly the Man and the Biosphere Program, as an important partner in implementation of the GBF, particularly in relation to strengthening area-based conservation, rights-based approach, and capacity building. Therefore, we propose to include in paragraph 16, after as well as, the following phrase: the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, through the Man and the Biosphere Program and its World Network of Biosphere Reserves. The rest of the paragraph remains the same. We have submitted this proposal in writing. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to be very clear. We are happy to hear any intervention that you wish to give us, but there will be an opportunity for written submission. Japan, followed by the Democratic Republic of Congo. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Japan would like to appreciate the co-chairs, the colleagues of the contact groups, and co-facilitators of the friends of the colleagues for their dedication in leading us in this intensive and constructive discussion in Nairobi so far. We all need to continue our effort toward the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15 Part 2 in December this year. Now is the last chance for us all to take urgent actions for transformative change towards nature-positive world and the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Having said that, we have some suggestions on the revised draft element of a possible decision for the adoption in COP15 contained in the document CBD-WG2020-3/3. We have submitted our written suggestions with rationale at the occasion of the first part of OEWG3. However, many points that Japan raised have not been reflected in the revised draft decision. Therefore, Japan submits again our points that have not been reflected in the revised draft decision for the Secretariat's consideration. Also, Japan would like to support the comments made by Canada and other colleagues and the comments regarding CBDL. That we will submit our statement along with specific text edits in writing, most of which are the same contents with our submission at OEWG3. Japan looks forward to further detailed discussion on the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, Japan. Je passe maintenant la parole à la
The floor goes now to the Democratic Republic of Congo, followed by Bolivia. Congo, you have the floor.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you for giving me the floor. The Democratic Republic of Congo is very preoccupied by the very slow pace we are following and the progress that is very slow here in Nairobi. It was expected for the works to have been completed in Geneva, and the whole thing has demonstrated the need for a prolongment of negotiations within the post-2020 framework. Many parties were those who did not find the whole process very stimulating. Now, we need to acknowledge, much to our surprise, that many other parties are not indeed favoring advancement of negotiations. There are, of course, proposals going into the sense of various objectives set, but the ideas that have been formulated have already been formulated, especially when it comes to specific targets and objectives. There are sections that have been discussed already. All this complicates even further our work so far. This framework that should have been adopted already since 2020 is still in suspense 2.5 years later. Hence, our concerns and our recommendation that negotiations are sped up for all those parts in red. We recommend that negotiations at the intersectional level be pursued towards accelerating an effort to find a compromise before COP15. We also recommend that the co-chair proposes a new working method for the 2 remaining days here in Nairobi, which would definitely facilitate the review of the draft decision to be adopted as of COP15. And to conclude, the Democratic Republic of Congo wishes to support the proposal by the European Union, which has also been endorsed by Cameroon. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, sir.
Merci à la République démocratique du Congo. I now pass the floor.
Thank you, Congo.
Bolivia, followed by Uganda. Bolivia, tiene la palabra.
Gracias, copresidente. Apreciamos el documento de.
Appreciate the document the draft decision. Nevertheless, we strengthen or highlight some elements that we believe should be considered and incorporated. First of all, to strengthen the view that the global framework, post-2020 global biodiversity framework should implement the objectives of the convention in the framework of their provisions and principles. The global biodiversity framework should aim also at strengthening living in harmony with Mother Nature and acknowledging that several countries have approved the right of nature and Mother Earth, thus contributing to strengthen the conservation of biodiversity and the sustainable use thereof. We must acknowledge that the first priority of developing countries is to reach sustainable development and the eradication of poverty. It must be taken into account that the allocation of financial resources must be done in the framework of Article 20 of the Convention, and for the same reason to reaffirm the equity and responsibility principles that are common but different. It must reaffirm the fact that the global biodiversity framework post-2020 should strengthen not only the actions of the countries, but also the holistic provision of the implementation methods. It must reaffirm the provision of financing, appropriate financing, and predictable financing for the countries, and also to highlight the predisposition of the countries in order to carry out the necessary efforts for the cancellation of their debts and to establish a multilateral restructuring of the debt mechanism for the allocation of these resources for the conservation of biodiversity. We also strongly support the need to highlight the Universal Declaration of the United Nations on the indigenous people's rights, and also the Declaration on the Rights of People that work in rural areas, and also the commitment of the governments in order for it to be implemented effectively, and also the support to indigenous people by means of implementations to strengthen their roles as guardians of biodiversity. These are some of the elements that we believe should be integrated in this document, and we will submit in writing our proposals. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Gracias, Bolivia. Now we'll pass the floor to Uganda, followed by Mexico. Uganda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Uganda shares the views expressed by the European Union and supported by Cameroon, Palau, and other parties. We also appreciate the concerns of Brazil and others, but wish to note that we have many unresolved issues in the current discussions, particularly on several issues that are covered in the elements of a possible decision to operationalize the post-2020 GBF. Like Canada, Colombia, and others, we now find ourselves in a position struggling to refrain from making observations about the draft elements that are not complete, and yet at the same time we are getting tempted to comment on the general and specific interventions that have just been provided on the draft decision. We find this approach and mode of discussion very awkward and procedurally should not be allowed, especially when negotiating a global instrument that is as fundamental as the GBF. We would have preferred to get a ruling from the co-chairs at the very outset on a procedure approach that is unambiguous, fair, and serves us all equally. Some of us now feel a level of discomfort with this approach. Nonetheless, co-chairs, we respect the positions of parties who have already made interventions on the draft decision. And with that said, co-chair, our position is that we wish to support and reiterate the position that it is premature at this stage to discuss the draft decision. Thank you, co-chair.
Thank you, Uganda. I will now pass the floor to Mexico, followed by China. Mexico, tiene la palabra.
Merci. Monsieur Co-
Thank you, co-chairperson.
Entrar en una discusión si aún no tenemos total.
Mexico agrees with not discussing this document. We support the document of Switzerland about the need to support other conventions, and we highlight that we have to go beyond the conventions of Rio with everything related to biodiversity. We demand to systematize and integrate in an effective manner with what they report. We also need to strengthen the cooperation with the subnational governments since they are the ones that will implement the global framework, because this will support the federal work and it will help us in attaining our goals and targets. We would like to support Norway and New Zealand about the commitments on human rights and the critical role that indigenous peoples and local communities have. But we also need to acknowledge the importance of women and girls.
That will derive from the recommendations of Working Group AG in 2019 on the development of a new program of work and institutional arrangements on Article G and other provisions of the Convention related to indigenous people and local communities. Agradecemos todos los
We would like to thank all the proposals and everything related to the development of capacities and the transfer of technologies, capacity building, and we would like to remind you that we need the implementation needs of all sources for an effective implementation of the framework. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Mexico. I will now recognize China, followed by the Philippines. China, you have the floor.
谢谢主席。
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. China supports the decision by the co-heads that we continue the discussion on the second part meeting of COP15. At the same time, China would like to emphasize the below points. First, the framework should reflect the fundamental and principal points For example, paragraph 3, some principles. It says all nations are entitled, in accordance with the current UN regulations, as long as its own national resources they can develop. And paragraph 4 about the territory of administration. So we would like to emphasize that for the future implementation, we should keep the implementation within the framework. Under the scope of the convention, we should emphasize that too. In the IG targets, we hope the targets can also be included in the new framework, that the future GBF will give all the parties a flexibility to implement. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Co-Chair, we would like to briefly highlight some key aspects which we believe should be reflected in the COP decision that will operationalize the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First, we believe that there is a need for the draft decision to reflect the need for the GBF to engender transformative change as called for in key reports such as in IFBE's Global Assessment, the GB05, and the LB02. We also believe that this draft decision must recognize indigenous peoples and the local communities, women and youth, as key partners in implementation, whose contribution should be recognized and supported. Further, it is key to reinforce here that the framework must be implemented using rights-based approach and in line with principles such as intergenerational equity and gender equity. We are committed and ready to support the implementation of the post-2020 GVF, and we expect the same commitment from countries, sub-regional, regional, and international organizations, as well as private sector, to engage fully and effectively towards living in harmony with nature. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Philippine. We'll now give the floor to Belarus, followed by Iran. Belarus, you have the floor.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to thank the co-chairs and the Secretariat for the draft. And we would also like to underline that item 9 of this decision is very important. It is about the help that Environmental Fund should provide to the developing countries for them to be able to implement the framework. But we think that there is one word missing. It is the word all. All development countries should be entitled to receive this financial help. And it will be also enable all the countries to implement their responsibilities. But we have now noted that during yesterday's discussion, the GEF does not plan to involve all the countries into this process. This should be avoided. Thank you, Mr. President.
Peru. Iran, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, colleagues and Secretariat. Islamic Republic of Iran wants to thank you for preparing the draft elements. Iran suggests inviting and using the capacities of all relevant UN programs and initiatives, including UNDP, UNEP, FAO, United Nations Academic Impact, and etc. And the implementation of GFP requires the support of both domestic and international institutions and resources to all parties, irrespective to any political and economic restrictions. GBF requires using the capacity of both national legislations and international commitments. GBF needs multi and bilateral cooperation of different institutions and parties, and also requires enhancing communication, education, and public awareness, and innovation development capacities of all the parties to enhance knowledge, information, and also mainstreaming of biodiversity conservation and restoration in all societies, including rural and urban areas. Thank you very much for all the efforts have you made.
Thank you, Iran. Let's move to Peru on Interactio, that will be followed by Togo. Peru on Interactio, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, copresidente.
Thank you, co-chair. We would like to express our support to the draft decision. We would like to highlight as well the items 1 and 2 of the draft decision, and to make the following comment. Mr. Co-Chair, we demand ambitious but realistic goals, and we believe that we must take into account the mega diverse countries such as Peru that cannot have goals giving priority to all species or to all taxons, because for us it is very complicated to implement it in practice. Nevertheless, we are not expressing that the goals should not be ambitious, but we ask, because of this, the need to give priority to the species that are more endangered, the degrading ecosystems, and the genetic resources of the species, endangered species. We believe that the conservation of ecosystems contributes significantly to the biodiversity conservation. We strongly support the protection of 30% of ecosystems as meta-global. We believe that the targets should be clear, measurable, and short, and it should not be duplicated. And in connections to financing, we would like to remind the commitments in writing in Article 20. Finally, Mr. Co-Chair, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity in order to express our statement. And I would like to mention that we will be submitting the review of our contributions, of our specific contributions. We will send them in writing. Thank you.
Gracias a Peru. We would like now to give the floor to Togo, followed by Ethiopia. Le Togo, vous avez la parole.
Togo, you have the floor. Thank you very much, co-chairperson. Thank you, Secretariat, for the various projects and the resolutions drafted so far. Dear colleagues, dear co-chairperson, the post-2020 framework is the fundamental basis that will allow all member states to live in harmony with nature for the 8 years to follow. We wish this to be very ambitious, but we have to acknowledge the threats to biodiversity. Consequences are obviously dramatic for the community, especially when it comes to the risks to biodiversity. So we share Morocco's concerns and the concerns of Congo as to the slow pace of progress, and we need to have more engagement and dedication to the negotiation. Dear Chairperson, dear colleagues, we need to speed up. Otherwise, we'll be missing an opportunity to protect biodiversity and enforce local resilience, especially when it comes to vulnerable areas to the climatic change. We need to see advancement in terms of information and digital sequencing. We will be submitting more comments in writing. Thank you very much, co-chairperson.
Give the floor to Ethiopia, followed by Israel. Ethiopia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Ethiopia supports the draft decision of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Ethiopia realizes that the biodiversity is under severe pressure due to various drivers, including climate change. And it is highly urgent time to adopt the framework so that we will be in a position to save biodiversity currently and for the future generation in line with Sustainable Development Goal. At this time, parties, governments, and other groups could understand that biodiversity is being lost daily and have to come to the consensus to progress toward this designing clear, understandable, and implementable targets at grassroots level. We should design clearly quantified or measurable targets, and they must be simple and clear so that all implementers would easily understand to implement it. The decision of GBF should also establish a direct correlation and synergy between the goals and targets, and therefore commit ourselves towards making clean and enhanced negotiable text during our stay. We also emphasize on the need to put in place an appropriate monitoring mechanism, capacity development, and effective resource mobilization means, and the financial resource availability from all sources for effective implementation of GBF. Therefore, GBF should be adopted in line with the national priority, should have to contain effective communication strategy. It should emphasize adequate, timely, and predictable financial support mechanism, and urge parties and other governments to commit themselves to its effective and efficient implementation, that to be reported to COP16. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Ethiopia. I will give the floor to Israel, followed by Zimbabwe. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Israel is hoping for an ambitious GBF, and we think that it is vital that we have an agreed framework launched at COP15 at Montreal. This is important for the international community and important for Israel at a national level. But there is a lot of work to be done, and there is not much time left. Still, we are confident that this can be achieved on time. For this, we need to try and find the consensus needed that we all came here to Nairobi for. We also think that targets should be short and measurable. We agree with our colleagues from Ethiopia on the issue of climate change. And in light of the climate change crisis, there is even more to gain by launching the GBF. As the connection between the climate change and biodiversity crises are becoming more and more apparent, we need to act now. Both are urgent to be resolved, and both can be resolved. COP27 for climate change will be held at Sharm el-Sheikh just a month before COP15, and there are very high hopes for that meeting. There should be very high hopes for COP15 too. Thank you.
Thank you, Israel. And I'll now give the floor to Zimbabwe, and that will be completing intervention by parties. Zimbabwe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Zimbabwe would like to thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your guidance and leadership this far. We are, however, worried about the delays that are so imminent in the room through the introduction of new text. This is despite every party agreeing to having a concise text and a workable GBF to take to COP15. We may also wish to remind parties that this is only a framework document and parties are free to customize it to suit their national circumstances. Having said that, Mr. Chairman, we would like to reiterate that discussion should be focused if we are to have a post-2020 draft GBF before COP15. All parties should strive for compromise rather than sticking to national positions, which is quite evident from the comments that we are receiving in this particular room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Zimbabwe. We will now move to intervention from other governments, followed by observer organization, beginning with major group. I would like now to give the floor to the Holy See. The Holy See, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. The Holy See fully shares the urgency of adopting the post-20 global biodiversity framework. In the light of the grave situation due to biodiversity laws and other serious environmental threats, the GBF requires the widest possible cooperation on a common plan. The Holy See calls for a clear, effective, and unambiguous language in the GBF, avoiding non-agreed and controversial language. In particular, the Holy See does not accept the proposed language, persons of diverse gender identities, in their list of stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Holy See. I will now move on to the major stakeholder group. Each statement, again, should not exceed 3 minutes. I see a request from the floor from IPLC. IPLC, you have the floor.
And then you. Gracias, presidente. Esta intervención es en nombre del Foro Internacional.
Thank you very much. This is on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum for Environment. We are very concerned and we would like to express that this is in line with the criminalization against the indigenous groups when defending their territorial ancestral lands. The indigenous peoples would like to see the following reflected in this draft. First of all, acknowledge and recognize the importance of the indigenous groups as local stakeholders, major stakeholders, guaranteeing their full participation in the decision-making processes regarding biodiversity, and also ensuring the participation of women and youth. Second, to support the local indigenous communities in the defense of nature and which are crucial for biodiversity. Third, we would like the collective rights and human rights of indigenous groups and general population when it comes to human rights be reflected in the decisions. We would like for it to be considered the fact that we need to move forward within the text in order for us to make sure that we need to improve our decision-making processes in the face of COP15. We believe that our full participation is guaranteed in all meetings, so we can move forward with the negotiations to make sure that we can follow up the decisions, the draft, the corrections, and the implementation of the process. We support also the youth network that is going to be presented before the Secretariat. Thank you.
Au Niger, suivi.
Niger, you have the floor.
If you could activate your microphone. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Co-Chair, the bilateral system to share resources, and we have the principal voice and the privileged voice in this protocol. Today, a lot of documents have been cited, but it is important to have bilateral agreement, and unfortunately we have been taking delays despite the good efforts from all the stakeholders. We are trying to look for solutions. We need to make sure that we have the right conditions in place. Mr. Co-Chair, for the African group, the multilateral mechanism could be an ideal solution for the challenges we have in front of us. And in guaranteeing the respect and the use of digital sequence information and genetic resources, we can ensure resources for Africa and different conditions on these themes. We ask the countries to cooperate in order to remove the brackets which are hindering more progress. Thank you, and we're going to send our written agreements. Thank you.
Followed by women. Youth, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. We support the statement made by the IIFP and the Women's Caucus. We appreciate and support the interventions by parties that have called for the recognition of the key contributions of indigenous people and local communities, women, and youth to the implementation of the GBF. We re-emphasize that implementation will only be effective when it follows a rights-based approach and also strongly supports statements that have called for the draft decision to recognize this. We look forward to engaging in future discussions on the draft decision so that it provides a strong impulse for the urgent and transformative action that will create on-the-ground impact for young people and future generation, and will kickstart a GBF that will engage us fully and effectively. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, youth. Let's now turn to women, followed by academic and research. Women, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Allow me, before sharing our text proposals, to raise a very important point. Our understanding is that in Contact Group 4 of this meeting and previously in Geneva, there has been growing support for a standalone target on gender equality for the full implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We need to make sure that this does not get lost in translation. We should not lose this opportunity, as it happened in Rome 2 years ago, where this target was proposed, supported, but forgotten to be included in the official report. So far, 50 parties and counting have manifested loud and clearly their commitment with women and girls through a standalone target on gender equality. Please look around. All of those flowers that you see distributed on the desks represent each of those gender champions. To all of you, our sincere thanks. In order to support the great efforts this meeting is making to ensure gender equality, human rights-based approach and the whole of society approach are truly embedded in the post-2020 GBF, the CBD Women Caucus suggests the following text proposals to the draft COP decision. They are 5 proposals. I will do it very quickly. Proposal 1, Section 2, Para 3, to add gender responsive and whole of society when referring to financial resources and the implementation of the framework. Proposal 2, Section 2, Para 5H, to add after cooperation with other conventions, including those related to human rights. Proposal 3, Section 2, Para 9, to add in relation to the Global Environment Facility, and financial support to eligible countries and directly to indigenous peoples and local communities and women groups. Proposal 4, Section 2, Para 10, to add women, children, and youth. And Proposal 5, Section 2, Para 18C, to add from a rights-based approach. We kindly ask you, Mr. Co-Chair, to ask party for their support to either all of our proposals or one or more of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Yus. Your comments will be documented. I don't think there is a need for support at this point in time. Let's move to academic and research. And as you have been very efficient in your comments, I'd like to move on to a few comments by organization. So, academia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Briefly, I would like to put under consideration of parties 4 comments. First, in the preambular text, besides emphasizing the need for a balanced and enhanced implementation of the Convention's 3 objectives, I would like to suggest that also the text reflects that the 3 objectives of the Convention are mutually supportive. This is important to highlight that sustainable use and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources are also important means for biodiversity conservation. The second is that in relation to capacity building activities and the effective sharing of knowledge, there it is suggested also to include women and youth besides the indication of IPLCs. The third suggestion is that specifically in operative paragraph 11, it is suggested to improve its clarity to avoid mixing participation with contribution in the implementation of the GBF. The specific suggestion is to make a differentiated call on one hand to enable the full and active participation of right holders, meaning IPLCs, women and youth, in the implementation of the GBF, and on the other hand, to make a differentiated call for contributions from civil society organizations, private sectors, and others to the implementation of the GBF. Finally, it is suggested to make explicit the relevance of the international law on human rights, not only in the draft decision, but all through the GBF. A clear human right-based approach in the GBF will contribute and will be a truly transformative approach in biodiversity action, recognizing that without the well-being of right holders whose livelihoods are closely related and dependent on biodiversity, it will not be possible to advance effectively in the 3 objectives of the Convention. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, academic, and it warmed my heart to hear your voice again. Let's move to NGO. Can the microphone be given to microphone 238, NGO?
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of WWF. We believe that the COP decision should provide overarching guidance to the implementation of the framework and its relations with other processes and agreements. Therefore, we support the suggestion from the Philippines on the inclusion of reference to the rights-based approach. In addition, we have the following 3 suggestions for the draft decision. To include clarification in paragraph 11 and to provide guidance on how a whole-of-society approach can be enabled, namely through multi-stakeholder processes and the implementation of sectoral plans of action for key sectors. Secondly, to include a new paragraph 12 bis to urge parties to ensure synergies with other agreements and frameworks and the Sustainable Development Goals. And thirdly, in paragraph 13, to recommend that biodiversity-related SDG targets with a 2020 timeline should be continued in line with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We have specific text proposals for these suggestions, which we will submit to the Secretariat. And if needed, we seek support from parties for these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, NGO. I see no more requests for the floor. Thank you, Delegate, for sharing your view. We're now reached the end of this discussion on the draft COP decision on agenda item 4. We heard a very rich discussion and heard some really good suggestions from Delegate. We will prepare a revised text as a CRP for the consideration of a later plenary session, and that CRP will include the request made by many for written input later. I will now hand over to my co-chair for the closing of this meeting. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, co-chair. Thank you for taking us through that agenda item. Dear delegates, we are approaching the end of our meeting today. But before we close, let me invite the Secretariat to give us some announcements. Secretariat.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to update you on two friends of the chair co-leads that will take place right after this meeting. One is on T9, on target T9, T19.1, and it is in conference room 11. And the other one is on section J, and I think that will continue in room 3-4. So just to remind you, right after this, we have two friends of chair, and they will go on till 7:30 when the two contact groups will start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretariat. Just before we close, do I see Namibia? Namibia, have you taken the floor? Have you requested for the floor, Namibia?
Thank you, Co-Chair. Just a question of clarification. At the beginning, you indicated that there might be a discussion about the proposal for a new target on health. When will there be a decision by the parties about whether to include that? Where will that discussion take place? Please, just if you could clarify. Thank you.
Okay, just 1 minute, Namibia. Okay, Namibia, I think you follow up that subject to come up on contact group 4. Okay. Okay, so dear delegates, this now brings us to the, sorry. Just a moment. Okay, Namibia, to get back on that subject again, I said it's going to take place in contact group 4, but again, the discussion there may decide where to place that very proposal on health. Okay? Yeah, there's no prejudice as to why it will take place there now. It's just that we discussed that, but it could go anywhere within the framework. Yeah. Thank you. So, dear delegates, with that, we now come to the conclusion of our meeting today, and the meeting is now closed.